The Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory stood as silent snow-crowned sentinels over the valley. They were jagged, ancient, and entirely unforgiving, yet for the last 3 years they had also served as a fortress. It was the winter of 1886. The biting wind still possessed teeth gnawing at the heavy pine boughs, but it no longer carried the scent of death. The Broken Ridge Ranch had not just survived the blood fever, it had conquered it. Gabe Montgomery sat atop his massive draft horse, Goliath, exhaling a long, steady breath that plumed into the freezing morning air. The rugged mountain man looked down at the lower pastures. They were no longer graveyards. Hundreds of healthy cattle, thick-coated and strong, moved with purpose across the frost-covered earth. Their hides were pristine. Their eyes were clear. Gabe's slate-grey eyes softened. He reached up, adjusting his wide-brimmed Stetson against the glare of the morning sun bouncing off the snowdrifts. For a decade, he had fought this wild land with nothing but brute strength and stubbornness. But it was not his strength that had saved Broken Ridge. It was the brilliant mind of the woman waiting for him back at the cabin. He turned Goliath toward home. The cabin had changed since the day Saline first arrived with her heavy padlocked trunks. It was no longer just a shelter for a solitary trapper. Gabe had spent the last 2 summers felling timber, expanding the homestead. To the left of the main living area, bathed in the natural light of 4 large glass-pane windows, was the sanctuary. Inside this newly built wing, the scent of wood smoke and lavender was overpowered by the sharp, sterile tang of carbolic acid and sulphur. Saline Montgomery stood over a beautifully crafted mahogany workbench, her vibrant green eyes narrowed in absolute concentration. She wore a heavy leather apron over her wool dress. Her mahogany hair was pinned back elegantly, though a few rebellious strands framed her sharp, intelligent face. She held a glass vial up to the light. The amber liquid inside caught the reflection of the snow outside. 3 years ago, she was a disgraced scientist, fleeing the patriarchal rigidity of the East Coast. Today, she was a saviour of the frontier. Her research on the Texas tick and her revolutionary arsenic sulphur dip had been published under her own name, altering Western veterinary science forever. Ranchers from as far as Wyoming and Idaho had made the pilgrimage to Broken Ridge asking for the cure. Saline gave it to them freely. She refused to patent the exact ratios, insisting that life-saving medicine belonged to the people who worked the land, not to the banks. The heavy wooden door opened. A rush of frigid air swept through the room, making the flames in the glass lanterns flicker. Gabe stepped inside, stomping the snow from his heavy hide-wrapped boots. He took off his thick gloves and walked up behind his wife. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his massive muscular arms around her waist, pulling her back against his broad chest. He buried his bearded face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin. "The herd is strong," Gabe rumbled, his deep voice vibrating against her back. "Not a single sign of weakness. You did it again, Mrs. Montgomery." Saline smiled, setting the glass vial down carefully into a wooden rack. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, covering his large, calloused hands with her own. "We did it, Gabe," she corrected him softly. "Science is only an idea until a man with enough courage is willing to build the vat and push the cattle through it." He turned her around, his slate-grey eyes locking onto hers. The raw, undeniable chemistry that had sparked between them on the day she stepped off the stagecoach had not faded. It had only deepened into an unbreakable, profound devotion. He leaned down, brushing his lips against hers in a slow, reverent kiss. But the quiet sanctuary of the mountain was about to be shattered. A strange sound echoed through the valley. It wasn't the rhythmic crunch of a stagecoach, nor the heavy plodding of a supply wagon. It was the crisp, synchronized trot of 4 matching thoroughbreds pulling a carriage far too elegant for the rugged trails of the Bitterroot. Gabe's posture changed instantly. The tender husband vanished, replaced by the lethal instincts of the mountain man. He stepped away from Saline, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of the Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. He moved to the window. A black polished carriage with velvet curtained windows came to a halt in the centre of the muddy yard. The driver, clad in a thick wool coat, hopped down and opened the door. 4 men stepped out into the biting Montana cold. 3 of them were obviously hired muscle. They wore cheap heavy dusters, but the way they stood, balanced eyes constantly scanning the tree-line hands resting near their open coats, marked them as Pinkerton dropouts or syndicate enforcers. But the 4th man was the true anomaly. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a silk cravat, and a heavy cashmere overcoat with a fur collar. He held a silver-tipped walking stick, tapping it lightly against the frozen earth. His face was sharp pale and entirely devoid of emotion. He looked at the sprawling ranch, the healthy cattle in the distance, and finally the sturdy log cabin. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his cold, dead eyes. "Stay here," Gabe ordered softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "They aren't local," Saline noted, picking up a heavy iron wrench from her table, slipping it smoothly into the deep pocket of her apron. "And men who dress like that don't travel to the end of the world just to say hello." "Exactly," Gabe said. He grabbed his Winchester repeating rifle from the rack near the door, resting it casually over his shoulder, and pushed the front door open. The bitter wind howled, whipping the tails of Gabe's buckskin jacket. He stepped onto the wide wooden porch, an imposing silhouette of raw, untamed power. "You're lost, mister," Gabe called out. "The stage depot is 5 miles back towards Stevensville." The man in the cashmere coat stepped forward, stopping at the base of the porch steps. He looked up at Gabe, unbothered by the heavy rifle resting on the mountain man's shoulder. "I am exactly where I intend to be," the man said. His voice was smooth-cultured and dripping with an arrogant authority. "I am Arthur Vance. I represent the Vanguard Medical Syndicate, headquartered in Chicago. I am here to speak with Dr. Saline Miller." Gabe's jaw tightened. "There is no Dr. Miller here. There is only Mrs. Montgomery, and she isn't taking visitors." Before Vance could reply, the screen door creaked open. Saline stepped out onto the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband. She did not cower. She looked down at Arthur Vance with the calculating precision of a scientist studying a mildly interesting yet poisonous insect. "I am Saline Montgomery," she said, her voice ringing out with terrifying composure. "State your business, Mr. Vance." Vance's cold eyes slid over her. He seemed momentarily taken aback by her striking presence, but he quickly recovered, flashing that empty practice smile. "Mrs. Montgomery, your published papers regarding the eradication of the Buphalus annulatus tick have caused quite a stir on the East Coast. Vanguard Medical has recognized the monumental financial potential of your arsenic and sulfur compound." Vance reached inside his coat. Gabe's thumb instantly hovered over the hammer of his Winchester, but Vance only produced a thick leather envelope. "I am authorized to offer you $50,000. Vance announced the sheer magnitude of the number hanging heavily in the freezing air. It was a fortune. Enough to buy half the Bitterroot Valley. "In exchange, you will sign over the exclusive patent rights to the formula, all of your research notes, and a legally binding agreement that you will cease producing or distributing the cure independently." Saline did not blink. She didn't look at the envelope. She looked straight into Vance's eyes. "No." The single word cut through the wind like a razor. Vance's smile faltered. He clearly hadn't expected a flat refusal. "Mrs. Montgomery, perhaps you don't understand the sum I am offering. $50,000. You could leave this squalor. You could return to civilization." "This is civilization, Mr. Vance." Saline replied, her tone laced with absolute steel. and my formula is not for sale. If Vanguard Medical gains exclusive rights, you will manufacture the dip and sell it back to these ranchers at a premium they cannot afford. You will create a monopoly built on the blood of dying herds. The formula belongs to the frontier." Vance's pale face flushed with a sudden ugly red. The polite facade cracked, revealing the ruthless corporate predator beneath. "You are a very naive woman." Vance sneered, his voice losing its smooth cadence. "Vanguard Medical does not take no for an answer. The market demands this cure. We will own it, whether you sell it to us or whether we are forced to acquire it through other means once you are no longer in a position to object." The three hired enforcers stepped forward simultaneously, their hands slipping beneath their dusters. Gabe moved with the explosive, terrifying speed of a mountain cat. He didn't bother levelling the heavy Winchester. He racked the lever with a deafening clack, chambering a heavy round, and pointed the barrel directly at Vance's chest. The air suddenly felt violently charged. "You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my land." Gabe growled, his voice a low, thunderous warning that made the horses attached to the carriage stamp nervously. "If you or your dogs take one more step toward my porch, I will paint the snow with your brains. And I assure you, Vanguard Medical won't send enough men to drag your bodies back to Chicago." Vance froze. He looked at the massive scarred mountain man, realizing with absolute certainty that Gabe was not bluffing. The enforcers hesitated, waiting for an order, but Vance held up a gloved hand. "You are making a fatal mistake, Montgomery," Vance whispered, his eyes filled with venom. "Accidents happen in these mountains. Fires break out. Men go missing. I highly suggest you reconsider. I will be staying at the hotel in Missoula. I expect a telegram by the end of the week." "You'll get nothing but lead if you ever cross my fence line again," Gabe promised. Vance turned sharply, marching back to the carriage. The enforcers backed away slowly, their eyes locked on Gabe's rifle before climbing inside. The carriage driver cracked his whip, and the thoroughbreds lurched forward, dragging the elegant vehicle back down the muddy trail, disappearing into the shadows of the towering pines. Gabe slowly lowered his rifle. The adrenaline was pumping hard through his veins. He looked at Saline. She was staring at the retreating carriage, her green eyes dark with a terrifying realization. "They aren't going back to Chicago. Gabe," she said quietly, the heavy wind tearing at her words. "I know," Gabe replied, his grip tightening on the walnut stock of the Winchester. "They came to buy a formula. Now they're going to try and steal it." The sky above the Bitterroot Mountains began to darken, bruised with the purple and black of an incoming storm. The cold deepened. The quiet sanctuary was over. A new war had just arrived at Broken Ridge, and this time the enemy wasn't a microscopic parasite. It was the greed of desperate men. The sun bled out behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, plunging the valley into a suffocating icy darkness. The wind did not just blow, it shrieked. It battered the heavy log walls of the Broken Ridge cabin, searching for weaknesses. Inside, the massive stone hearth roared, casting long dancing shadows across the bearskin rugs, but the warmth did not reach the corners of the room. The lingering threat of Arthur Vance and the Vanguard Medical Syndicate hung in the air like an executioner's axe. Gabe Montgomery sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair, bathed in the amber glow of the fire. He was not resting. A whetstone rasped methodically against the 12-inch blade of his bowie knife. Schlick, schlick, schlick. The rhythmic sound was a physical manifestation of his tension. His slate-grey eyes were fixed on the reinforced door, his ears tuned to the frequency of the mountain night. He knew how predators operated. They didn't strike in the light of day. They waited for the cold. They waited for exhaustion. In the adjacent laboratory wing, a single kerosene lantern burned. Saline was not sleeping either. The encounter with Vance had confirmed her worst fears. The corporate vultures from the East Coast did not care about the lives of cattle or the livelihoods of the men who raised them. They cared only for the monopoly. Anticipating the worst, Saline was meticulously transcribing her master formula and years of field observations into a smaller, leather-bound journal. If Vanguard Medical wanted to erase her work, she would ensure the knowledge survived, even if it meant hiding it in the very bones of the mountain. The heavy brass clock on the mantel ticked past midnight. Gabe stopped sharpening his knife. He tilted his head. The wind was howling a chaotic symphony of cracking timber and rushing air. But beneath the noise, his finely tuned instincts caught an anomaly. It was a subtle shift. The sudden frantic stomping of hooves from the main barn. Goliath and the other horses were agitated, and animals, especially those raised in the shadow of grizzly bears and mountain lions, did not panic without a reason. Gabe stood up seamlessly. He slid the hunting knife into the leather sheath on his belt and picked up the Winchester. He checked the action, ensuring a round was chambered, and threw his heavy buffalo hide coat over his shoulders. He stepped to the doorway of the lab. Saline looked up, her green eyes reflecting the lantern light. She saw the rifle. She saw the cold, predatory stillness in his posture. "Something is wrong," Gabe murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "The horses are spooked. Lock the heavy iron bolt behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice." Saline didn't argue. She knew the wilderness well enough by now to trust his instincts implicitly. She nodded, standing up from her workbench. "Be careful, Gabe. These aren't wild animals. They're hired killers. Animals are predictable." Gabe replied, his hand resting on the latch. "Men just think they are." He slipped out the door, moving with a terrifying silent grace for a man of his immense size. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The temperature had plummeted drastically in the last hour. He stayed in the shadows of the porch overhang, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was a pale sliver, intermittently obscured by rapidly moving thick storm clouds. He moved toward the barn, keeping his silhouette merged with the dark shapes of the woodpile and the water troughs. The snow crunched faintly beneath his boots, a sound swallowed by the howling wind. As he reached the heavy barn doors, he found the source of the animal's distress. The heavy iron padlock had been shattered, not picked, but forcefully broken with heavy bolt cutters. Gabe pushed the door open just a fraction. The warm, musky smell of hay and nervous livestock wafted out. Goliath whinnied, stamping his massive hooves against the dirt floor. Gabe stepped inside, the Winchester raised. The barn was empty of intruders, but the damage was done. The saddles had been slashed. The harnesses, meticulously oiled and cared for, were cut into useless strips of leather. They were systematically crippling the rancher's ability to move or fight. A cold, calculating fury settled into Gabe's chest. He stepped back out into the freezing night, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He moved toward the lower pasture fence line. The barbed wire, a recent and expensive addition to the ranch, lay coiled and severed in the snow. They were trying to let the herd wander out into the impending storm, where the freezing temperatures and wolves would finish the job. The blood fever couldn't. Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural scent cut through the crisp mountain air. It was chemical, acrid, and volatile. It smelled like kerosene and coal oil. It was coming from the direction of the cabin, specifically from the newly built laboratory wing. Gabe's heart slammed against his ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. The slashed saddles and the cut fences weren't the primary attack. They were a diversion. They wanted him away from the house. "Saline!" Gabe roared. Abandoning all stealth, he sprinted through the knee-deep snow, his massive legs pumping, driving him up the incline toward the cabin with the desperate speed of a man watching his world end. Before he could cross the yard, the sharp, crystalline sound of shattering glass tore through the night. A Molotov cocktail, a heavy glass bottle filled with kerosene, and a burning rag smashed through the large window of the laboratory. For a split second, there was nothing but darkness. Then a violent whoosh of ignition. A massive fireball erupted inside the room. The volatile chemicals Saline used for her experiments, the sulfur, the alcohol, the purified ether caught instantly. The windows glowed a hellish, furious orange. "Saline!" Gabe bellowed, again his voice cracking with raw terror. He hit the front porch steps at a dead sprint. Inside the lab, absolute chaos reigned. Saline had been knocked backward by the concussive force of the blast. The heavy wooden workbench containing her notes, her microscope, and her chemical reserves was engulfed in roaring flames. The fire was spreading rapidly, crawling up the dry pine logs of the walls like a living, hungry beast. Saline did not scream. She scrambled to her feet, coughing violently, as the thick, acrid black smoke filled the confined space. Her eyes watered, stinging from the vaporized chemicals. Her first instinct was not to flee, but to save the work. She grabbed a heavy fire-retardant canvas tarp used to smother chemical spills and threw it desperately over the main cluster of flames. The heat was blistering. It singed her eyebrows and blistered the exposed skin on her hands. She grabbed a bucket of sand from the corner and hurled it at the base of the fire, fighting the inferno with a terrifying, single-minded determination. But the fire was too greedy. It licked at the edges of her leather-bound master journal. The heavy iron bolt on the main door rattled frantically. Then the wood splintered inward as Gabe kicked the reinforced door off its hinges with a terrifying display of brute strength. He burst into the smoke-filled cabin, his eyes sweeping the horrific scene. He saw Saline coughing, her apron smouldering, refusing to retreat from the burning desk. Gabe dropped his rifle. He grabbed a massive heavy bearskin rug from the living room floor and charged into the laboratory. "Get back!" he commanded, his voice a thunderous boom over the roar of the flames. He threw the heavy bearskin directly over the centre of the fire, smothering the oxygen. He used his thick, leather-gloved hands to beat down the secondary flames, climbing the walls, ignoring the searing heat that radiated through his coat. He fought the fire with the same savage intensity he would fight a grizzly stomping, crushing and suffocating the unnatural enemy. Saline grabbed another bucket of sand and helped him douse the remaining embers. For 5 agonizing minutes the cabin was a battlefield of smoke, flying sparks, and desperate action. Finally, the last orange tongue of fire hissed and died under the heavy bearskin. The laboratory was in ruins. The beautiful glass-paned windows were shattered, letting the freezing wind howl through the room. The wooden workbenches were charred and blackened. The air was a toxic soup of smoke, vaporized alcohol, and burnt fur. Gabe spun around, grabbing Saline by the shoulders, pulling her away from the toxic fumes and into the main living area. He dropped to his knees, pulling her down with him beneath the thickest layer of smoke. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her face, her arms searching for burns. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. The sheer terror of losing her had nearly unmade him. "I'm all right," Saline gasped, coughing violently into her sleeve. "I'm okay, Gabe." She unclasped her hands, clutched tightly against her chest. Singed at the edges, but entirely intact, was the small leather-bound master journal. They didn't get it. They didn't get the formula. Gabe pulled her against him, burying his face in her soot-stained hair. He held her with a desperate, crushing grip. "To hell with the formula," he whispered fiercely. "If you had burned—" He didn't finish the sentence. The thought alone was enough to plunge his soul into absolute darkness. He pulled back, looking at her blackened face. The fear in his slate-grey eyes was rapidly crystallizing into something far more dangerous. Pure, lethal rage. Gabe stood up, pulling Saline to her feet. He picked up his Winchester from the floor. He walked to the shattered window of the laboratory, the freezing wind whipping his beard. He looked out into the pitch-black tree line. Whoever had thrown the firebomb was out there, watching, waiting to see if the cabin burned to the ground with them inside. "They aren't trying to buy us out anymore," Gabe said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of the apex predator, the ghost of the Bitterroots awakening from a long slumber. "They want us dead. They want to burn the truth and take the ashes." Saline stood beside him, clutching her journal, her green eyes hardening into chips of flint. The sophisticated scientist from Pennsylvania was gone. She was a woman of the frontier now. "What do we do, Gabe?" Gabe reached down and pulled the heavy leather bandolier of 4440 cartridges from its peg on the wall, slinging it diagonally across his broad chest. He picked up his hunting knife and strapped it securely to his thigh. "We don't wait for them to burn our house down," Gabe rumbled, staring into the abyss of the mountain night. "Vance sent assassins. I am going to show them what it means to be hunted." Outside, the wind screamed, carrying the first heavy blinding flakes of a monstrous winter storm. The true battle for Broken Ridge had just begun. The dawn did not break. It merely diluted the pitch-black night into a swirling, suffocating grey. The storm that had been brewing over the Bitterroot Mountains finally unleashed its full catastrophic fury. It was a true Montana whiteout, a blizzard so dense and violent that it erased the horizon, the tree line, and very nearly the barn just 50 yards away. The wind was no longer a sound. It was a physical entity, a battering ram of ice and freezing air that slammed against the heavy log walls of the Broken Ridge cabin. Inside, the air was thick with the bitter smell of charred wood and stale adrenaline. Gabe and Saline had not slept a single minute. They had spent the harrowing, freezing hours of the early morning repairing the breach. Working side by side in the dim light of a single lantern, they had boarded up the shattered windows of the laboratory with thick pine planks, hammering massive iron nails into the frames, while the freezing wind fought them for every inch. Saline sat at the heavy oak dining table, her hands trembling slightly. Gabe had meticulously wrapped her blistered palms in clean white bandages, applying the soothing calendula salve she had crafted years ago. Despite the exhaustion, painting dark shadows beneath her vibrant green eyes, her mind was racing with terrifying clarity. "They won't attack in this storm." Saline reasoned, her voice low, trying to find logic in the chaos. "The temperature is dropping below zero. Men freeze to death in minutes out there. Vance's thugs are city men. They don't know how to survive a mountain blizzard." Gabe stood by the window, peering through a narrow crack between the heavy pine planks. His massive silhouette was a statue of pure tension. City men pay other men to do their dirty work. "Saline," Gabe rumbled, his slate-grey eyes scanning the blinding white chaos outside. "And money can buy a lot of desperation. They failed to burn the formula. Now they have to remove the obstacles. Us." He turned away from the window, walking over to the heavy iron-bound chest at the foot of their bed. He threw the lid open. Inside lay boxes of brass cartridges, coils of fuse wire, and his heavy Colt revolvers. He began to systematically load every weapon they owned. The metallic clicks and clacks of the ammunition sliding into the chambers echoed sharply in the quiet cabin. It was the grim soundtrack of impending war. Suddenly, Goliath let out a sharp, distressed whinny from the barn. The sound barely pierced the howling wind, but Gabe's finely tuned ears caught it instantly. He moved back to the window, wiping the condensation from the frozen glass pane. Through the churning veil of snow, dark shapes began to materialize. They were not wolves. They were men on horseback struggling against the waist-deep snowdrifts. 6 riders in total, moving in a tight, cautious formation toward the cabin. Gabe tightened his grip on the Winchester repeating rifle. He thumbed the hammer back. The metallic click was absolute and final. But as the riders drew closer, the lead horseman held up a flickering oil lantern. The amber light caught the undeniable glint of a tin star pinned to the breast of a heavy buffalo hide coat. It wasn't just a syndicate hit squad, it was the law. Sheriff Elias Cobb had taken over the badge 2 years ago after Tom Ryman retired to a quieter life in Helena. Cobb was a man of weak character, a politician with a gun who was known to look the other way when the wealthy cattle barons and corporate syndicates played dirty. He was a coward who hid behind the authority of his office. Gabe opened the heavy oak door, stepping out onto the wide snow-covered porch. The wind instantly tore at his clothes, biting at his exposed face like a swarm of angry hornets. He stood tall, the Winchester resting deceptively casually across his broad chest, his finger hovering inches from the trigger guard. "Morning, Gabe!" Cobb shouted over the deafening roar of the blizzard. The sheriff did not dismount. His horse danced nervously in the deep snow. Gabe's eyes slid past the sheriff. The 5 men behind Cobb were not local deputies. They did not wear the practical gear of mountain lawmen. They wore expensive heavy dusters, and their hands hovered dangerously close to their holstered irons. They had the hard, dead-eyed stares of the vanguard enforcers who had arrived in Vance's carriage the day before. "It's a bad day for a ride, Elias." Gabe yelled back, his voice slicing through the wind with lethal calmness. "You're a long way from the warmth of your office. I have a warrant." Montgomery. Cobb reached into his heavy coat, pulling out a folded piece of thick parchment. He waved it in the freezing air. "Signed by a federal circuit judge in Missoula late last night, right before the telegraph line snapped under the ice. You are under arrest." Gabe didn't flinch. "For what?" "Aggravated assault and attempted murder of Mr. Arthur Vance and his associates," Cobb declared, puffing his chest out. "Mr. Vance came into town bleeding, claiming a wild mountain man ambushed his carriage on the public road. Throw down the rifle, Gabe. You're coming with us." It was a lie, a meticulously crafted, legally binding lie designed by a corporate predator. Gabe's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "Vance sent his men to burn my house down last night, Cobb. Look at the boarded windows, smell the smoke. They tried to burn my wife alive while she worked. I don't know anything about a fire." Cobb sneered, wiping the freezing snow from his moustache, refusing to look at the scorched logs of the laboratory wing. "I just know I have a federal warrant for your arrest. I am taking you to the Missoula jail. Now put the gun down and walk off that porch." Gabe looked at the 5 fake deputies. The trap was brilliantly ruthless. If Gabe surrendered and rode away with them, he would never make it to Missoula. He would be shot in the back, trying to escape in the blinding snow. And worse, Saline would be left completely defenceless against the remaining Vanguard Syndicate thugs who were surely waiting in the shadows. But if Gabe resisted, he became a wanted outlaw. He gave them the legal right to slaughter him on his own porch. "I'm not going anywhere." "Elias." Gabe's voice dropped, carrying a deep, terrifying rumble that promised absolute violence. "You are riding with corporate assassins. If you want me, you'll have to earn the blood money Vance paid you." "You're resisting a lawful federal warrant," Cobb shouted, feigning shock, though a cruel, triumphant smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "That makes you a fugitive, Montgomery. By the authority of the territory, I am authorized to take you dead or alive." The 5 enforcers behind Cobb immediately drew their revolvers. But before a single shot could be fired, the heavy screen door of the cabin kicked open. Saline stepped out onto the porch. She was not holding a delicate derringer or a glass vial. She was holding Gabe's massive double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. The twin iron barrels rested steadily against her shoulder, aimed directly at the centre of Sheriff Cobb's chest. Her vibrant green eyes were devoid of fear, burning with the fierce protective wrath of a mother bear defending her den. "Those men behind you are Vanguard syndicate thugs. Sheriff..." Saline's voice rang out sharp, aristocratic and commanding. "You sold your badge to a pharmaceutical monopoly. If you or your dogs raise those irons one more inch, the first thing I will do is blow you completely out of that saddle. I guarantee you won't live long enough to spend Arthur Vance's silver." Cobb's horse stepped back, spooked by the sudden aggression. The corrupt lawman swallowed hard. He looked at the massive scarred mountain man with the repeating rifle and the highly educated, beautiful woman holding a literal hand cannon. The element of easy intimidation had violently evaporated. These were not simple ranchers to be bullied. They were survivors. The blizzard around them intensified. The temperature was dropping to a lethal degree. Standing in the open yard was rapidly becoming a death sentence, even for heavily clothed men. "You're making a fatal mistake, Montgomery." Cobb roared, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and genuine cold. He violently pulled his horse around. "You can't hold out. The pass is completely snowed in. Nobody is coming to help you from town. We have this entire valley surrounded. You either freeze-starve or walk out with your hands up." "Then we freeze," Gabe answered coldly. "But if any man crosses my fence line, he dies." Cobb spurred his horse, retreating into the blinding white curtain of snow. The 5 fake deputies followed suit, their dark silhouettes vanishing into the violent swirling grey of the tree line. Gabe and Saline stood on the freezing porch for a long moment, their weapons raised, watching the whiteout. The cold was absolute, seeping into their very bones. The silence beneath the howling wind was deafening. The reality of their situation crashed down upon them. The lockdown was complete. They were completely cut off from the world. The law meant to protect them was corrupt and actively hunting them. The mountain passes were impassable, and an army of heavily armed corporate mercenaries was waiting in the freezing shadows surrounding the cabin like a pack of starving wolves. Gabe slowly lowered the Winchester. He turned to Saline, his slate-grey eyes burning with an unyielding primal fire. He reached out his massive hand, gently covering hers, on the cold iron barrel of the shotgun. "They think the cold is their ally," Gabe whispered, pulling her back inside and slamming the heavy oak door shut. He threw the thick iron deadbolt, the sound echoing like a prison cell, locking. "They forget who they're hunting. This is our mountain. Let them freeze in the dark." The siege of Broken Ridge had officially begun. The sun surrendered to the storm long before evening, plunging Broken Ridge into an abyssal freezing darkness. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. Outside, the blizzard screamed like a wounded animal, a relentless, deafening roar of wind and ice that threatened to tear the roof from the heavy log cabin. Inside, the fires had been entirely extinguished. A glowing hearth would cast distinct silhouettes against the window boards, providing perfect illuminated targets for the mercenary rifles waiting in the tree line. The cold crept through the thick timber walls, a slow, paralysing poison that stiffened joints and slowed the blood. But Saline Montgomery was not paralysed. She worked in the pitch-black darkness of the ruined laboratory, guided entirely by touch memory and sheer intellect. She wore her heavy wool coat, her breath pluming in the freezing air, but her hands were bare. They moved with the terrifying precision of a master apothecary. She was no longer trying to save lives. She was engineering death. From the surviving supply crates hidden beneath the charred floorboards, she retrieved several small, thick glass vials, originally intended for storing blood samples. Into these she meticulously layered the chemical remnants the fire had spared. Potassium chlorate, red phosphorus, sublimated sulphur. She bound the vials tightly with heavy twine, adding thick iron nails and jagged shards of glass from the broken windows to the exterior. They were not elegant, They were rudimentary, highly volatile, friction-ignited explosives. 3 at the front door. Saline whispered to herself, her voice steady and clinical. 2 beneath the laboratory windowsill. The rest for the rear breach. Gabe watched her from the deep shadows of the living room, his heavy Winchester resting across his knees. He felt a profound, awe-struck reverence for the woman he had married. The Vanguard syndicate expected a frightened pioneer wife weeping in the corner while her husband desperately fired blindly into the dark. Instead, they had cornered a brilliant calculating scientist who was currently turning her home into a chemical minefield. They will move when the wind peaks. Gabe rumbled his deep voice, barely audible over the howling storm. The noise will cover their footsteps. They'll try to hit the front and back simultaneously to split our attention. Let them come, Saline replied. She picked up her heavy 10-gauge shotgun and a canvas satchel filled with her glass explosives. She moved to the front door, kneeling on the cold floorboards to carefully wedge 2 of the vials beneath the heavy iron hinges. With agonizing slowness, she ran a thin strand of high-tension wire across the porch threshold, tying it off to a loose nail. The weight was a psychological torture. Time stretched into an endless, freezing purgatory. Then the anomaly arrived. It wasn't a sound. The blizzard was too deafening for footsteps. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the pressure of the floorboards. The heavy oak door groaned slightly against its frame. Someone was on the front porch. Gabe stood up, a massive shadow detaching itself from the wall. He did not go to the front door. He moved to the small, heavy trapdoor that led to the root cellar beneath the kitchen. "Hold the line, Saline," Gabe whispered. He pulled a white canvas tarp over his heavy buffalo coat, completely masking his dark silhouette. When the flash hits, drop low. He slipped down into the root cellar, silently unlatching the hidden exterior storm doors that led out to the leeward side of the cabin, directly into the heart of the blinding whiteout. Above him, the assault began. A heavy wooden ram, likely a fence post, torn from the corral, slammed violently into the reinforced front door. The heavy oak shuddered dust falling from the rafters, but the thick iron deadbolt held firm. "Bet push it in, break the hinges," a muffled, aggressive voice shouted from the porch, barely cutting through the wind. The ram struck again. The door splintered inward just a fraction of an inch. It was enough. The heavy wooden door pushed against the high-tension wire Saline had rigged. The friction violently snapped the coarse twine, dragging the abrasive striker directly across the highly unstable red phosphorus inside the glass vials. The explosion was not a fiery, billowing eruption. It was a vicious, blindingly bright chemical flash, accompanied by a deafening concussive crack that shook the foundation of the cabin. A brilliant, searing white light illuminated the entire porch, instantly destroying the night vision of the 3 Vanguard enforcers who were ramming the door. The glass vials shattered, sending a lethal high-velocity shower of iron nails and jagged shrapnel tearing through their heavy dusters and flesh. Screams of absolute blinding agony cut through the howling wind. But the shrapnel was only the first phase of the trap. The burning sulphur instantly vaporized, creating a dense, suffocating cloud of toxic yellow smoke that rolled heavily over the porch. The blinded mercenaries dropped the wooden ram, clawing desperately at their throats, and eyes coughing up blood and bile as the highly acidic vapour seared their lungs. Inside the cabin, Saline had hit the floor the moment the wire snapped, covering her ears and nose with a damp cloth, just as the concussive wave rattled the dishes in the cupboards. She did not hesitate. She rolled to her knees, levelled the massive 10-gauge shotgun at the splintered gap in the door, and pulled the trigger. The heavy iron barrel roared. A cloud of buckshot tore blindly through the toxic smoke, slamming into the centre mass of the nearest screaming thug, throwing him violently backward, off the porch and into the deep snow. Simultaneously at the rear of the cabin, the remaining 4 mercenaries heard the explosion. Thinking the front team had successfully breached the house, they abandoned their stealth. They rushed the boarded-up laboratory windows with heavy iron crowbars, desperate to break inside and claim the bounty on the doctor's head. They did not know they were no longer the hunters. Gabe Montgomery rose from a deep snowdrift behind them like a vengeful spectre of the mountain itself. The white canvas tarp made him completely invisible in the raging whiteout. The blinding snow erased his massive silhouette. He was entirely in his element. The city-bred mercenaries were shivering uncontrollably, their eyes watering profusely from the freezing wind, their movements sluggish, loud and clumsy in the knee-deep drifts. Gabe moved with terrifying, lethal fluidity. He didn't use the Winchester. The lever action ran the risk of freezing, and the bright muzzle flash would immediately give away his position in the dark. He drew his heavy 12-inch Bowie knife. The steel gleamed coldly in the ambient light of the storm. He stepped up directly behind the trailing mercenary, a man who was desperately trying to pry a thick pine board from the window frame. Gabe's massive left hand clamped violently over the man's mouth and nose, stifling any scream, while his right hand drove the heavy steel blade upward, directly beneath the ribcage, piercing the heart with brutal, surgical precision. Gabe lowered the dying man silently into the snow, the hot blood instantly freezing on his white canvas camouflage. He moved to the next target. The storm swallowed all sound of the struggle. The second mercenary turned, suddenly sensing the absence of his partner, but he only saw a wall of swirling white snow. He never saw the massive leather-gloved fist that slammed into his temple with the force of a falling oak branch, crushing his skull instantly. 2 down, 2 remaining at the back window. One of the enforcers finally noticed the dark, motionless shapes lying in the snow. Panic, cold, primal, and absolute seized his chest. "Frank Billy! Where are you?" he yelled, his voice cracking. He raised his repeating rifle, aiming blindly, frantically, into the whiteout. Gabe dropped the canvas tarp, revealing his towering, terrifying form just 10 feet away. The mercenary gasped, his eyes widening in horror as he tried to bring the rifle to bear. Gabe threw the Bowie knife. The heavy steel blade spun once through the freezing air and buried itself to the hilt in the man's chest. The kinetic impact threw the thug backward, his rifle discharging uselessly into the stormy sky. The final mercenary, realizing they were being systematically slaughtered by a ghost in the snow, broke completely. He dropped his iron crowbar and turned to run desperately, trying to wade through the waist-deep snow toward the distant tree line, screaming for Arthur Vance to save him. Gabe did not chase him. He calmly reached over his shoulder, pulled the Winchester from its leather scabbard on his back and thumbed back the hammer. He raised the heavy rifle, completely ignoring the biting wind that whipped his beard and stung his slate-grey eyes. He breathed out, slowing his heart rate, tracking the fleeing silhouette through the dense, chaotic curtain of falling snow. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bellowed a sharp, authoritative crack that temporarily silenced the howling wind. A heavy .44 4-40 slug caught the fleeing mercenary squarely between the shoulder blades. He collapsed face first into the deep snowdrift and did not move again. The rear assault was entirely broken. Gabe walked slowly through the snow, retrieving his Bowie knife from the dead man's chest, wiping the bloody blade clean on the thug's expensive cashmere duster. He moved around the side of the cabin, the heavy Winchester held at the ready, approaching the front porch. The toxic yellow sulphur smoke was finally being ripped away and dispersed by the ferocious wind. 2 bodies lay motionless on the porch, shredded by Saline's glass shrapnel and heavy buckshot. The third man was missing, having likely crawled blindly away into the dark to bleed out or freeze to death in the timber. Gabe stepped up to the splintered, ruined door. "Saline," he called out, his deep voice carrying a terrifying calm. "It's me. The perimeter is clear." The heavy iron deadbolt slid back with a metallic clank. The door pulled open against the wind. Saline stood in the dark hallway, the shotgun reloaded and resting against her hip. Her face was smudged with black powder and sulphur soot, but her vibrant green eyes burned with an unbroken fierce light. She looked at her husband covered in snow and the blood of their enemies and felt no fear, only an overwhelming, profound pride. 6 dead. Gabe reported grimly stepping inside and locking the ruined door behind him as best he could. He looked at the shattered glass and the deep scorch marks on the porch boards. Your chemistry is far more terrifying than my rifle, Mrs. Montgomery. Science is merely the application of natural laws. Gabe, Saline replied, a weary but dangerously sharp smile touching the corners of her mouth. And the natural law of Broken Ridge is that trespassers die. The immediate assault had been brilliantly repelled. They had broken the teeth of the Vanguard Syndicate's first wave with a devastating combination of intellect and firepower. But the storm was still raging with apocalyptic fury, and Arthur Vance, alongside the corrupt Sheriff Cobb and the main body of heavily armed mercenaries, was still out there, waiting in the freezing dark. The final bloody crescendo of the winter siege was yet to come. The monstrous blizzard that had sought to bury Broken Ridge finally began to break in the quiet, agonizing hours just before dawn. The deafening howl of the wind tapered off into a hollow, haunting whistle. The dense curtain of white snow thinned, revealing a landscape transformed into a frozen alien world of towering drifts and lethal icy stillness. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence was more unnerving than the storm. Gabe and Saline stood by the shattered, boarded-up windows, their breaths pluming in the freezing air. The temperature had stabilized, but it was still bitterly cold. "They are running out of time," Gabe whispered, his slate-grey eyes scanning the pale, greying horizon. "Vance knows that once the sun rises and the storm clears, the neighbouring ranchers will see the smoke. The telegraph lines in Stevensville will be repaired. If he doesn't have the formula and our bodies by sunrise, he has nothing but a mass grave of his own men to explain." Desperation makes men careless. Saline noted, reloading the twin barrels of her heavy 10-gauge shotgun. She clicked the breech shut, the metallic snap ringing with absolute finality. Outside, the crunch of heavy boots on frozen snow broke the silence. Gabe peered through the narrow slat. Arthur Vance was no longer hiding behind his syndicate enforcers. The polished corporate executive was forced into the brutal reality of the frontier. He stepped out from the shadow of the tree line, his heavy cashmere coat plastered with snow, his face pale and drawn tight with absolute manic fury. Beside him was Sheriff Elias Cobb, shivering uncontrollably, his tin star dull under the grey morning light. Cobb looked like a man walking to his own execution. Only 2 mercenaries remained flanking them with their Winchesters raised, but their eyes were darting, frantically terrified of the unseen ghost in the snow. "Montgomery!" Vance screamed, his cultured voice cracking, stripped of all its arrogant veneer. "I know you're out of ammunition. I know you're freezing. I have the law on my side. Send the woman out with the journal, and I will let you ride away." Gabe looked at Saline. A slow, dark smile spread across his weathered face. "He really doesn't understand the mountains, does he?" "He thinks everything has a price," Saline replied, her green eyes cold as glacial ice. "Show him what Broken Ridge costs." Gabe unbolted the heavy oak door. He did not step out with his hands raised. He kicked the splintered door fully open, stepping onto the blood-stained porch with his Winchester levelled perfectly from the hip. The price just went up. Vance." Gabe's voice thundered across the frozen yard, echoing off the granite peaks. The 2 remaining mercenaries panicked. They had seen what the mountainman could do in the dark. They fired wildly their bullets, splintering the porch roof above Gabe's head. Gabe didn't flinch. He worked the lever of his Winchester with blinding mechanical speed. Crack, crack. 2 heavy .44-40 slugs found their marks. The mercenaries dropped to the snow, their weapons falling silent forever. Sheriff Cobb, realizing he was now standing entirely alone with a madman against the deadliest shooter in the Bitterroots, broke. "I didn't want this," Cobb shrieked, dropping his revolver into the snow and raising his hands high into the freezing air. "He made me do it. Gabe, Vance paid me. I surrender. By God, I surrender." Vance sneered in absolute disgust. "You pathetic, useless coward," he hissed. Without a second of hesitation, Vance drew a beautifully engraved silver-plated Colt Lightning from his coat pocket and shot Sheriff Cobb squarely in the back. Cobb gasped, a look of profound shock freezing on his face, before collapsing face forward into the snowdrift. Vance immediately swung the silver Colt toward Gabe, his eyes wide with a desperate, cornered madness. "If I can't have the formula, nobody will." Gabe raised his Winchester, but the freezing temperature had taken a toll on the intricate lever mechanism. The metal action jammed the frozen grease, locking the chamber half open. Vance smiled a twisted, victorious grimace and cocked the hammer of his pistol. But Arthur Vance had forgotten the cardinal rule of Broken Ridge. He had forgotten the scientist. Before Vance could pull the trigger, the heavy double doors of the root cellar on the side of the cabin burst open. Saline emerged not with her shotgun, but with Gabe's massive Sharps .50-90 buffalo rifle braced heavily against the frozen timber of the porch railing. She had slipped out during Gabe's distraction, positioning herself for the perfect crossfire. "Mr. Vance!" Saline's voice rang out sharp and clear as a ringing bell. Vance snapped his head toward the sound. He saw the beautiful soot-stained woman staring down the iron sights of a hand cannon capable of dropping a grizzly bear at 500 yards. Saline didn't blink. She squeezed the trigger. The massive Sharps rifle bellowed, with a deafening roar, a localized explosion that shook the snow from the pine branches. The heavy lead slug hit the snowbank merely an inch from Arthur Vance's feet, with the kinetic force of a runaway locomotive blasting a geyser of ice dirt and frozen mud directly into his face. The shockwave knocked Vance entirely off his feet. His silver Colt flew from his hand, lost in the deep powder. He scrambled backward in the snow, deafened, terrified, and completely disarmed. Gabe vaulted over the porch railing, his massive boots hitting the frozen ground with a heavy thud. He crossed the yard in 3 terrifying strides, grabbed Arthur Vance by the lapels of his expensive cashmere coat, and hauled the corporate predator effortlessly into the air. Vance kicked and sputtered. His immaculate suit ruined his arrogance, completely shattered. He looked into Gabe's slate-grey eyes and saw the raw, untamed fury of the frontier staring back at him. "Please," Vance choked out blood trickling from his nose. "I have money. I can make you rich. I can—" Gabe slammed Vance violently against the heavy wooden post of the corral, knocking the remaining breath from his lungs. Gabe drew his 12-inch Bowie knife, the cold steel pressing gently but firmly against the pulse point of Vance's throat. "Your money means nothing here, Vance." Gabe rumbled his voice, a lethal whisper. "You brought fire to my home. You threatened my wife. In the mountains, that is a blood debt." "Put him down, Gabe." Saline walked slowly across the snowy yard, the heavy Sharps rifle resting against her shoulder. Her green eyes were fixed on the trembling corporate executive. "If you kill him, you become exactly what they are," Saline said calmly, stopping beside her husband. "A murderer. And I did not marry a murderer. I married a man of honour." Gabe held the knife against Vance's throat for 1 agonizing second longer. Then slowly he lowered the blade and let the terrified executive slide down the wooden post into the snow. "The telegraph lines will be up by noon." Saline looked down at Vance with absolute freezing contempt. "We will wire the federal marshals in Helena. We have the bodies of your hired guns. We have a dead, corrupt sheriff whom you shot in the back, and I have the journal of formulas that proves your motive. You are going to a federal penitentiary, Mr. Vance, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life behind iron bars, knowing that a woman from Pennsylvania beat you." Vance hung his head, sobbing quietly in the snow, his empire of greed entirely dismantled. As if on cue, the heavy bruising clouds above the Bitterroot Mountains finally broke. The first brilliant blinding rays of the morning sun pierced the grey, spilling golden light across the pristine, snow-covered valley. The storm was over. Gabe turned his back on the broken man in the snow. He looked at Saline. The morning light caught the mahogany strands of her hair, the soot on her cheek, and the fierce, beautiful resilience in her eyes. He reached out, pulling her into his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of sulphur-cold air and absolute survival. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad waist, holding on to the rugged mountain man who had become her shield, her sanctuary, and her greatest love. Down in the lower pasture, the surviving cattle moved slowly through the drifts, searching for the winter wheat beneath the snow. They were strong. The ranch was safe. The formula was secure. The legend of Broken Ridge would spread across the untamed West. It would not just be a story of a cure for a blood fever, but a testament to an unyielding devotion. A story of how a scarred, solitary giant and a brilliant, fearless woman stood together against the worst of humanity, and proved that true wealth lies not in gold or patents, but in the unbreakable strength of standing side by side in the storm. The sun sets on another tale of the untamed frontier, but the spirit of the West lives on. Thank you for riding with us here at Dust and Justice. If Gabe and Saline's fight for survival and unbreakable love kept you on the edge of your seat, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Would you have let Vance live to face the law, or did the mountain demand a different kind of justice? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another story forged in the fires of the Wild West. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart steadfast.